Welcome back to The Critical Gentleman. Today we're going to discuss how vintage watch collectors are influencing the modern watch industry and how that might shape the future of our hobby. Before we get started on the topic of the day, I'd like to just take a second and thank everyone for the positive feedback and support on my latest videos since returning to YouTube. Over the last few years, watch collecting has blown up as a hobby, and it's been really fun for me to meet people in the community and participate by creating these videos, and I just want to thank you for following my channel and supporting this whole way. I'm appreciative to those of you who have stuck around for the last 3 years, and for anyone who's just joining us, welcome, and please don't forget to subscribe because there's a lot more content coming your way. The watches in front of you right now are all the vintage pieces from my collection, many of which I've discussed in my previous video, my vintage-inspired watch collection. There are a few pieces here which I did not have at the time, most notably this Bulova Ambassador, which is run by a micro-rotor movement, this gold Omega Seamaster from 1962, which is a caliber 560, and most importantly, the 1969 Omega Speedmaster Professional. But all of these watches were produced in the 1960s, including the 2 Rolex and all of the Omegas. When I first got into collecting wristwatches, I was immediately drawn to the vintage aesthetic, both because of the size and their design elements, which many watches today seem to lack. Fast forward a few years and you have vintage watch-related communities popping up all over the internet constantly. Whether it's an enthusiast website, a new dealer, or a new YouTube channel, there are many people still flocking to this hobby. While at first that may mean a more efficient market where deals and rarities are more difficult to find, it also means we get more representation in the modern watch market when manufacturers are vying for our dollars over the vintage pieces which make them no money. Anyway, back to the topic at hand. How is the vintage watch market shaping the modern watch industry today? As demand and interest in the vintage watch market continues to grow, as indicated by auction prices and the number of pieces available for sale on websites like Chrono24, it becomes clearer that there are many people getting into this hobby for the first time. With so many potential customers clamoring for unavailable products, it's no wonder that modern watch manufacturers have decided to bring back some of the timeless designs that people are seeking out. Even brands that may not be re-releasing specific vintage models are styling their watches after these old designs. Vintage-styled limited editions such as the Omega Ultraman or Speedmaster Trilogy make it very clear that manufacturers are trying to get in on the action. Being able to sell new products that look like vintage pieces will undoubtedly help their bottom line. Doing so, however, can be risky as they gamble with the desirability of their pieces in the eyes of both vintage collectors and people who may be used to a more modern style watch. Watch brands are treading carefully, trying to please their customer base while keeping a sense of innovation and originality. This is why we start to see watches that deviate from the styling of their vintage counterparts, but still reflect the style of the age. Take for instance the first Omega in space. This watch is styled after the Omega 2998, which was a Speedmaster before they had the word professional, and as a matter of fact was the first watch that made it into orbit. That's why this is called the first Omega in space. Now there are many similarities between this watch and the one that went up into space, but there are just as many differences between the movement and the crystal and some of the hands. This watch is really not a re-edition. It is a reimagining. It is vintage styled, but in no way, shape, or form could you consider this a reissue. Next to its sister, the Omega Speedmaster Professional, you can certainly see the differences between the vintage and modern piece, as well as between these two models which I outlined in my video comparing the Moonwatch and the FOIS. However, this comparison serves to illustrate my point that even Omega, who wants to reissue old watches or old style watches to please their consumers, is still trying very hard to make them not identical. Then you have watches like my Breitling. This piece is not modeled after any particular watch made by Breitling previously, but takes stylistic cues from the Chronomat of 1942 as well as the first Navitimer. There is no vintage piece whose looks match this one exactly, but just looking at the watch you can tell it is styled after an older generation of aesthetic. The smaller size and simpler dial reflect Breitling's intention to release a vintage-oriented piece but without copying any particular design from their past. In the last 3 years, most vintage re-editions have fallen into one of these two categories. Either a watch that was very closely styled after a vintage piece but had certain differences, either the glass or the movement or something else, or a watch that was meant to look like it was vintage but didn't particularly reissue any model specifically. And then you get to the third category of watch, and that is a direct reissue. Now, the only watch that I own which falls into this category is the Tag Heuer Carrera reedition. This watch came out in the 1990s, but still was one of the very first reissues. This watch is extremely faithful to the original piece, both in terms of size, function, and aesthetic. I do have a full review of this watch up on my channel, but to break it down, the only thing that separates this piece from its vintage counterpart is the word Carrera on the dial. It is not present on this watch, but otherwise it is a direct clone of the original Heuer Carrera from 1964. Where does that leave us? Last year I posted an admittedly harsh review of the Tag Heuer Skipper, which was produced in conjunction with the website we all know and love, Hodinkee. That watch was more similar to this Breitling in that it was not exactly a reissue of any particular vintage piece, but cobbled together a few features from different models to create something more inspired by that vintage aesthetic. And while I admit I was probably overly critical of that timepiece in my review, I did say in the video that in 2 to 5 years we would be seeing more vintage styled pieces being released by modern manufacturers. And that has held true. If you look at current offerings from both major and micro brands, you will see smaller sizes, different shades of color and luminous material, and more authentic vintage styling in many of their releases. This indicates to me that manufacturers are trying to get a piece of the vintage market rather than letting secondhand dealers and eBay reap the benefits. As long as watchmakers continue to see that the vintage market is thriving, it will spell good news for those of us who prefer watches in that style. I don't think it's too late to get into vintage if you haven't begun yet, because there are still high-value pieces available out there like this Bulova Ambassador or a smaller size Omega Seamaster. Having said that, I think many of these reeditions, as long as they come in at reasonable prices, will continue to be a boon for modern collectors. What's amazing to me is in the last few years we've seen the price of vintage watches soar at auction, probably most obviously demonstrated by the sale of Paul Newman's Paul Newman for almost $12 million. It's no wonder modern brands want to be included on the fun, and I'm interested to see what's in store over the next few years. Anyway, I just thought it was really interesting that vintage style watches and even straps seem to be taking over the marketplaces all over the internet. I'll be keeping a lookout for new releases and hopefully discuss them here when the time comes. For now, thanks for watching The Critical Gentleman, and we'll see you next time. Paul Newman's Paul Newman. Say that 3 times fast.